This is Peter Helland and David Wimhoff on the show Citizens for Community Media here in Notre Dame, South Bend, Indiana. We're going to call the show Another World War. And we're going to try to get our thinking grounded as deep as we can. And I believe, of course, theology is the best way to ground it. In Genesis 3:22, it says, "Then the Lord God said, See, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil." Verse 1 of chapter 4. "Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord." It goes on. "And Cain said to his brother Abel, Let us go out to the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where is your brother Abel? Cain said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground." And 1 John chapter 3 brings this up. Verse 12, "We must not be like Cain, who was from the evil one and murdered his brother." And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. And James says, "Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder. And you covet something and cannot obtain it. So you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly in order to spend what you get on your pleasures." So we have a type of war going on. We have one actually with Russia and Ukraine, and it certainly seems to me that we're the main player supporting Ukraine. We're sending over billions. So there is this religious conflict, the religious values of America, seen in the government, and the religious values of Russia, seen in their government, represented by Putin. What we've read here is, God said, they have become as one of us. And they have a child, Cain, and he rises up. It says he rose up against his brother and killed him. Some translators say where, and Eve said, I have produced a man from the help of the Lord. Some commentators say, I have produced the Lord. Well, whatever, Cain could have been pretty proud in some way or another. And that pride is like, in his pride, he goes, am I my brother's keeper? You know, he's pretty haughty talking to God there. Well, you just killed your brother, like no big deal. Rose up against him. Why would Cain be that way? God didn't create Adam and Eve to be that way originally. So now we see original sin acting. And God says, they have become as one of us. I don't think there's probably agreement exactly on the church fathers what exactly that means. But we see pride coming in. Because we're not God. Now somehow, Cain and Abel picked this up. Or, Abel didn't pick it up. Cain picked up the bad part. So he's proud. He rises up against his brother and murders him. And that's the first killing that we see on the earth. And we're given a view as why did it happen? John says why it happened is, why did he murder him? Well, he says, first of all, he said he was from the evil one. Why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. So Cain was not, and I just heard this, he wasn't giving the best, and there's many interpretations on this, okay, but he wasn't giving the best of the first fruits. And Abel was. So whatever it was, Abel was more pleasing to God in some fashion than was Cain. And Cain led to that. And then we read, you know, where do conflicts come from? So is there a way to look at things? Because my take is good statesmen, Christian statesmen, try to look at things from a theological point of view and oftentimes a scriptural point of view to ground their thinking solidly. I don't know if America has too many statesmen that are capable of doing that really well.
Well, I think that's what the Protestant revolt did in the 1500s. Destroyed Christendom. So it destroyed statesmen acting on Christian Catholic principles. And if you look at the history of international law, it grew up from two main sources, interesting enough. One from the Catholic Church and from the Catholic faith. And that include canon law and ecclesiastical law, and included Roman law.
And common law, too. Isn't common law fit in? Or?
Common law fits in there, too. That developed, too, on a local level. But it also grew up, international law also grew up from commercial trade, from commerce.
Like the UCC, Uniform Commercial Code?
That was part of it. That came along after a while. But until that time, you had a lot of issues with the transport of goods and people on the high seas. So you had to deal with a lot of admiralty issues to begin with. Because the more commerce there was on the oceans, then the more you needed rules to govern how that's supposed to work. So you had these two sources of international law, two main sources. And when the Protestant Revolution came, I mean, they call it a Reformation. It was, in a way it was more of a revolution. It kind of broke the two apart. And you had countries where the statesmen were not operating from a shared set of principles with the Catholics, who saw the Pope as the supreme arbiter of disputes between international countries. He was the guy who arbitrated the problems, who resolved the problems. Well, when you break that union,
but he was going to arbitrate her based on Scripture and tradition. His understanding of
Scripture, tradition, and the
he's going to
situation
bring that
on
kind
the
of
ground.
understanding and
That's
say,
right.
well, and here's my reasoning. I mean, he would lay it out, and they would trust him.
He would lay it out, and they would trust him. And sometimes if they didn't, he excommunicated them. And then he absolved the subjects of any sort of loyalty to that king or emperor. And that happened more than once. That happened quite a bit. And he was the rule keeper, and he was the arbiter of peace. But we don't have an arbiter now, do we? We don't have anybody you can go to and say, let's arbitrate this thing.
Yeah, you can mediate, but mediate doesn't deal with the issues. I mean, I'm dealing with something myself, but the arbiter grounds this thing in solid reasoning and thinking as to who's right or wrong, or you know how he sees it. You know, you guys are wrong, or because he's got to know where the truth lies.
But you also have to have other things going on, and you have to have. The popes have repeatedly said, especially since Leo XIII, they have repeatedly said that you can have all the laws and all the armies and navies in the world, but if you do not have the basis of the laws based on the divine positive law, you're going to have conflict. If you don't have a shared understanding of law, of the basis of the law, you're going to have conflict. So what he's saying is on the international level, and this has been repeated by Pius XII, that was repeated by Benedict XV, and even up to modern days. If you do not have a shared idea, a shared religion, a shared viewpoint to quell, to control the heart and all of its ambitions and envies and greed and whatever, all the armies and all the rules in the world aren't going to make the difference, and the UN Charter is an example.
If you're coming to the table and you believe in science and evolution, and the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel is something you believe absolutely didn't happen, it's just a story and a myth. But you do believe in the latest scientific Darwinian understanding of the world, which is ultimately survival of the fittest. A law that's founded on scripture and tradition versus a law that's founded on ultimately survival of the fittest. You got two different bases where the group is coming from. One group is coming from this, the other one's coming from ultimately it's survival of the fittest. So what are they willing to do?
I think that's right. And I think that there's an English professor by the name of A.C.F. Beals who really kind of confirms what you're saying. And he got a great quote here. He converted to Catholicism in 1935. He taught at King's College most of his career, which was about 40 years, in London or in England. And he said, capitalism distorted the international order. He said, it is unlikely that there can be any stable international order so long as chronic social ill health persists within individual states. And that's from his little book. You can't get it anymore. It's called The Catholic Church and the International Order. And it's really a very scholarly book, because what he's saying there, he's saying that exactly what you're saying is that if you have a disordered society in one of these states, it's going to affect the international community. Now, capitalism got a big boost with the creation of the United States, okay? Got a real big boost. The seeds were already there in England and in France. I mean, England, yes, in France to a degree, and Holland to a degree. The ideas were there, the seeds were there as early as the 1600s.
But you are saying capitalism is a big factor here, and America started with a huge emphasis on commercialism.
America was the spirit of commerce, according to Thomas Pownall, who was a royal governor of Massachusetts in 1757 and 1760. The spirit of commerce is what gave this country, gave the revolution its impetus. It was that desire for commerce. And what you had after that is he wrote two books. He wrote a memorial to the sovereigns of America, another one to the memorial to the sovereigns of Europe, and he said America is going to be the new center of the universe. And this was 1760s. The American founders had this book. They knew that.
Right, and then we were looking at Putin's speech, right? And the Saker, we were looking at, what do you call that guy's name, the Saker?
I have no idea. I know I'm familiar with the website, the Saker.
Yeah, I think he said he was born in Switzerland, but he's had a popular. So he was commenting on Putin's speech from.
Yeah, he was giving commentary, I think it was.
Right, and so Putin basically said, and this is the Saker they call him, and he says, and now he said it. Now Putin said it openly and directly. What Russia is threatened by and struggling against is pure Satanism. And he goes on and explains, and he says he's speaking to the Russians on that, and the Russians understand what he's saying. But I brought this little book along, which was cost a lot of money. There's only 4 copies. When I got it, there was only 4 copies left in the world.
What is that book?
That's the original. This is the original of the book by John Fletcher, 1776. He wrote it because there was a big.
So that's from 1776?
Oh yeah, the original.
Wow.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
And the title, 1776, American Patriotism, Farther Confronted with Reason, Scripture, and the Constitution, being observations on the dangerous politics taught by the Reverend Mr. Evans and the Reverend Dr. Price, with a scriptural plea for the revolted colonies. John Fletcher, Vicar of Madeley. Okay. And this is why we say we don't have the statesman, because they always, back then, they'd have the title, then they'd have a quote from some famous person. Well, they quote from Baxter. Okay, Baxter was a dissident theologian, but he was considered he was very highly esteemed. So Baxter says, skill in politics contributeth not a little to the understanding of divinity. I learned more from Mr. Lawson than from any divine, especially his instigating me to the study of politics, in which he much lamented the ignorance of divines, did prove a singular benefit to me. No, that's old way of talking. But he's saying, if you don't have if you don't understand politics, and if you're not, both sides have to know it. In other words, if you're a theologian, you better know politics correctly, and if you're a politician, you better know theology. So this idea of separation, church and state, you better not be tempted because we have that. You better know your politics, and you better know it well, especially from a theological point of view. If not, you're going to be lost.
Well, states are moral actors. The church has always held that. States are moral actors like individuals. So they are subject to the moral law like individuals are. But the Catholic view is that the nation, okay, the nation is there for the full development of the person, okay? And the international order is there for the full development of the person. Therefore, no nation can act all by itself supreme to the international order. That's the Catholic view.
The international order, which is being directed by the divine positive law.
Supposed to be directed by the divine positive law.
If they're doing the right thing.
If you're doing the right thing, and that's why it's so important to base societies on the divine positive law to avoid that disorder in one society that could lead to international disorder.
Right, and see, so if you were a good theologian or statesman, you would take the story of Cain and you'd realize, yeah, it was taught that he killed Abel out of envy because his actions were not righteous and Abel's were. So if a nation is not acting morally, they don't have God's blessing, and now they could fall into what Cain fell into and be envious or be disordered. That's what I think.
Right.
Yeah, because if it happens there right in the beginning, the first person that was ever born.
That's right.
From parents that were created perfectly in the image and righteousness of God.
That's right.
Image and likeness of God. The fall created the first person who was a murderer. That's quite a fall. And now we're all in that condition, and if you're not fighting it, if you're not fighting your own pride and envy as a nation to live righteously, you're going to fall. You're going to find yourself in one conflict, in one disaster after another.
Well, I think there is a nuance to that, and I think that what Professor Beals didn't necessarily expound upon, because he was writing around 1941, is that this idea of capitalism, where everything is determined by by its economic value, where the economic value of things is the ultimate determiner of good and bad, which I think is a slightly different definition from what Marx would say. But this idea that orders societies, that's what you base the society on, is a disorder in society, because societies are there for the purpose of building virtue and helping the person achieve their full vocation, which is in the common good. The common good is the sum total of those conditions which help a person to achieve their ultimate calling. Their ultimate calling is to be with God in heaven. It's got a material aspect to it, and it's got a spiritual aspect to it. The Vatican II document spoke extensively about this. In Dignitatis Humanae, it mentioned the common good very clearly. And elsewhere, I believe in Gaudium et Spes, it also mentioned it too. And I believe it also mentioned it in Inter Mirifica. But it talks about the common good being at the national level, and there's an international common good. So the church is always for things like international peace, okay? Stop the arms race, full development of people, meaning that the wealthy, give of their wealth and their ability to help the poorer countries so they're not so poor. And the Catholic Church has always said, and even in the Catechism, which no one seems to want to read, it talks about a reform of the international economic systems, okay? Reform the economic systems of the world, especially the financial systems of the world. And it is specifically stated to that effect in the Catechism. And that is what the popes of recent time have called for. Of note, I think is very interesting, is Pope St. John Paul II said one of the reasons the countries in the West are so wealthy is because of their technology, their know-how, their intellectual property. He said that's why they are so wealthy.
Silicon Valley, they were the leaders. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Is he suggesting anything wrong there?
Well,
or a responsibility?
There's a responsibility. With great wealth and ability comes a responsibility. So he says, we are supposed to be in the system of solidarity. That is the economic system that the Catholic Church advances, solidarism or solidarity. And that is all throughout the Catechism. Father Heinrich Pesch wrote about that years ago. I think he passed away in 1926. So he wrote this huge book about it, a series of books. And so that is the Catholic method, because the solidarism takes into account the human soul, the human spirit, as well as the ability to people to make a fair profit. Now, what capitalism did, whether you look at it from Marx's point of view or the Church's definition, what capitalism did is it did encourage survival of the fittest in a social sense. And it is my contention, it also gave a competitive advantage to the United States, to the Americans, and to the West in general. But more particularly, it gave a competitive advantage to the elites in the United States, because they were able to financialize what was going on. And that was capable of being tied into their hands because of the almost sacred right, as guaranteed by the Constitution, almost a sacred right to hold and own property without anyone else taking it. The Catholic Church says you can have property and riches and wealth. Okay? We're not against that. We're not against private property. But the ultimate goal of that property is to the people of the world. Again, everything I'm talking about is from the Catechism. It's all in there.
This would be like if you're telling you're the grandfather and you're instructing your sons. Yeah, you can have, and you're the Christian grandfather. Yeah, you can have wealth in that, but let me tell you, it could danger your soul if you're not careful.
Right.
And that's kind of similar. You're instructing.
It is.
The father gets his instruction from the church, from the scripture, but the nation has to speak similarly. It has to warn people and govern how those riches are, or you can't tolerate their souls being damned. You have to warn them.
Right. That's exactly right. So that brings in the issue of who's in charge in society. Who's in charge? Okay? Is it the government, where the ultimate power is? Or is it the powerful private interest? You and I have talked about this a lot. That's the ultimate fight, and we see that with Joe Biden's speech to the UN on September 21st. We see very clearly he's saying, we're about democracy over here, and Putin, he calls Putin by name. He says Putin is about autocracy.
Was that the one this year, or was that the one that was one
this
in 2007?
Year, September 21
okay.
of 2022.
Okay. But he also gave that speech, I think, in 2017, saying that Russia was the main threat to Western values.
Yeah, he probably did. I mean, Russia and China have been on the radar of the United States for the national security strategy since at least 2008, more likely 2010. I did an article on it about, we've seen this movie before. Ukraine is about China. And then if you track the national security strategy, they name Russia and China as revisionist powers, okay, which is not good. All right, not good, because they don't have our values. They don't have democratic values.
Well, revisionist is you're going against their narrative. You're revising their official narrative.
They're revising their narrative, right?
You're not accepting their narrative.
They're taking a step backwards, okay? If you're going to say the government's got the power, you're taking a step backwards. Because what Thomas Paine said is, well, all the power's in the civil society, right? Civil society knows better. Government's a necessary evil. What that means is that the businessman, that the powerful private interests, that the financial interests have the real power in society.
Holds the power.
You can see this in the life of Elbridge Gerry, one of the founders of this country. And he was a merchant, and he was very wealthy. He was from Marblehead, Massachusetts. Only 2 books have been written on this guy. It's amazing. He was the guy who signed the Declaration of Independence, but he wouldn't sign the Constitution.
Yeah, I remember I kind of liked him because he was like Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry wouldn't go to the...
No, he didn't sign it for a different reason.
Different reason?
He wanted the First Amendment. He said, I want our rights protected.
Oh, I'm wrong then, okay.
That's what, it was him and George Mason and a third guy, I think Randolph from Virginia. They said, no, this doesn't go far enough. We want our rights affirmatively protected with the First Amendment, which is no established religion, free exercise of religion, free speech, free press. Why would a merchant want that? Because they saw the power of the written and spoken word. They saw where the revolution in America started, okay? It wasn't, people on the ground, really. It was really the merchants in America, which gives credence to what I said earlier. Thomas Pownall saying very clearly in his book, A Memorial to the Sovereigns of America and Europe, saying very clearly, this was the spirit of commerce which gave rise to this revolution.
And as you know, I was there at January 6th. I went to all 3. But I went there going against the narrative there. Okay, the narrative at January 6th amongst the, I thought there was millions of people there, was we're the government, they're our servants, looking at the Capitol. We pay their wages, and that's the people's house. Which is, okay, so you're saying they aren't really the government. You're really the government. But who of you then?
Right.
Who of you? I mean, are you guys just going to keep it right there and just kind of fantasize? Well, you're going to hit reality. I said, you're not real. You're going to hit reality. Don't act on that.
What people don't understand is that when you're talking about democracy or a Republican form of government, yeah, we may all have the same vote, but the reality is we don't have a lot of power to shape the issues or to control the issues. And so when they talk about this idea of democracy where every man is equal, the reality is that the people who have more stuff or more ability or are better positioned in an equal setting, they have more power than the rest of us who are equal, okay? The idea with the conflict between these ideas of what Joe Biden calls, democracy and autocracy, or democracy and statism, and I talk about it in my book. The problem is that the Catholic configuration of the state says the state is supposed to control society and act on behalf of everybody in society. This is where St. Thomas Aquinas got it wrong. He said democracy devolves into tyranny. No, it doesn't. It becomes a plutocracy. He got that wrong. History has borne him out to be wrong in that regard.
Because from the people will arise the powerful people, and the powerful people are the ones generally that have the money that give them the power.
That's right.
And so they end up speaking on behalf of the people.
They end up saying, we got the voice of the people.
And who can say they don't? I mean, they have the power just to say it.
That's right. Who's to say they can't?
Now, Putin said in that speech he gave that he's up against Satanism, satanic forces. And that is what Fletcher argued in this book. He said the principles of the patriots that they're fighting for, their theology is, this notion of self-government. He said, it's satanic. He said, Jesus was the opposite. Not my will, but your will be done. Satan had just the opposite, and he gives the comparison. He said, these principles are satanic. That was Wesley and Fletcher. Wesley ended up with the biggest denomination in America for a long time, the Methodist Church. And how Putin is almost saying the same thing as Fletcher, because he said this thing happened a couple hundred years ago. He said this thing has been moving this direction.
Well, didn't he say in his speech of September 30th that these are the fruits of this system?
It's the fruits of these principles that we were warned, that you're going to say that the people are the government and that you can self-govern. But if everybody self-governs, then I guess you don't need a government.
But wasn't Fletcher also saying that the people are saying we can govern without God? Isn't that what Fletcher was saying?
By saying, in a sense, you're denying what St. Paul taught, that apart from Christ I can do nothing. In me is no good thing. It creates a proud, you shall be as gods. That's a proud mentality. Adam and Eve had a certain mentality before the fall. They were creatures created by the Creator, and they had to obey Him, and there was a certain fear. Wisdom is the fear of God. Well, now you have become as God. You don't take orders from anybody, okay? God doesn't take orders from anybody, and now you're free to be gods. You give orders, and nobody can tell you what to do.
So what you're saying is what Fletcher said is that this idea of democracy is an idea that says that the people are, in governing their affairs, are superior to anything God may offer.
Yeah. When they started,
their authorities from themselves. I'm sorry.
When they introduced democracy into amongst the Puritans, John Cotton, who was probably one of the leading Puritans at the time, he's commenting on this new notion of democracy. At least it was new for this time. He said, well, if the people are in charge, if the people self-govern, then who governs the people then? The people?
The people govern the people.
Well, isn't that almost like communism? Wasn't communism the idea that we're going to get this going, and for just a little while, the 2% will kind of have to be in, to get it going. And then once it gets going, the thing will just self-pilot, it'll just go on its own. Well, that's a lie. I mean,
people will just know the right thing to do, right? That's what communism was, and that's, in a way, to a degree, what this experiment is about, too.
Yes, you will intuitively know, you'll kind of just go by gut feeling.
See, and the church says, you can have a democracy, that's fine. But, the church has always taught you can have a democracy, but the basis of your laws must be God's law. And if you have God's law, then He has only one religion and one church, and you're supposed to establish that. And there's a practical aspect of that, which is that if you have an established church and established religion, then all your judgments are compared to that religion. So you don't have things like pornography. You don't have things like abortion. You don't have things like gay marriage, okay? All that stuff that we've talked about before. But if the people are the ultimate authority, right, then they can have all those things.
Yeah. I mean, Paul said to Timothy, there'll come a time when they won't be able to endure sound doctrine. If you spend all your time watching TV that's infiltrated with all kinds of subtle fornication and all that, and you soak it in, well, you might have a hard time staying sexually pure. So that God's law is going to be a bother to you because you can't keep it, and you don't like it because you've already allowed yourself to be weakened.
So let me just say a few things about the UN Charter, if I could, because that deals with the international order. Okay, so one thing that Biden said at the UN was that this is Putin's war. He's trying to destroy the Ukrainians as a nation, as an entity, and he waged war aggression is the big no-no. And that's true. The United Nations, okay, let me back that up. That's a big no-no. Let me correct what I said. A big no-no, according to the United Nations, is no more war, okay? Because that came about in June, that charter, the UN Charter came about June of 1945. The Second World War was not entirely over. It was very destructive. It got even more destructive after that. but there was this desire to end these big wars, okay? But they set forth certain principles, okay? And I think it's worthy talking about them in Article 1 and Article 2. Some of those principles were that, and I'm just going to read them from Article 1. To maintain international peace and security, take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to peace and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace, and to bring about by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law. You know, you could say justice is hearkening to the Catholic theme, which was the popes like Pius XII talked about, but these guys weren't Catholics writing this document necessarily. They weren't necessarily referring to that. But principles of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace. Now, we've heard of Professor Mearsheimer, we've heard of Professor Sachs talk about how, you know, NATO kept moving one way. There was a revolution in the Ukraine. You had the government, the lawful government was overthrown, and we got some government that is going to be adverse to Russia. Russia's saying, stop, let's work all this out. And they keep saying this, and nothing ever happens. So to achieve, develop friendly relations, to achieve international cooperations, Article 2 says all members shall fulfill in good faith the obligations assumed by them in accordance with the present charter. All members shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means. Okay? So this is shall and good faith. And if we go to the UN site, it defines good faith. It means unilaterally you can't pull out, which means all the countries have got to work together to avoid possible breaches of the peace and to settle the disputes. So that's not working so well.
Well, I had this thought. In other words, World War II, you had, this is one take on it, that Stalin was prepared to invade Russia. I mean, to invade Europe.
Invade
he was
Germany,
prepared.
right.
He was prepared to invade Europe. Churchill was prepared to invade Norway right before Germany took Norway first, just in the nick of time. Hitler saw, he knew that Europe was about to be invaded. He beat Stalin to the punch. Okay, now it's reversed. So Putin is seeing that he's being encircled. Okay, we're moving our equipment, our biolabs into Ukraine, and now he's being encircled by NATO, and he's going, this is a threat that if I don't act, they're gonna take our sovereignty away. That's their aim. So he acted. Now that's the argument, right? Why he was justified to do what he was doing.
I think that is an argument to say that he was trying to resolve things in good faith, and the West was not acting in good faith. I think that is an argument. The problem that you have is, to whom do you make this argument? Because without the Pope and everybody in the same religion, then you have to just simply appeal to the nations out there, you know, the world, and they voted back in March, 100 of them, to condemn Russia for the aggression, as the invasion as aggression. And so you had about 40 that either abstained or opposed it. And so that is a practical issue that you are dealing with, because you're saying, okay, for instance, Putin is saying, I don't see good faith by you guys in the West. You're moving this thing toward me. I don't want it near me. There are things going on in neighboring countries I don't tolerate. And you have to look at that and say, okay, well, maybe perhaps under the UN Charter, he's got an argument saying the West was not operating in good faith. In the Catholic faith, if you look at the Catechism, countries may still resort to armed warfare if efforts at peace fail. That's clearly stated in the Catechism. In the absence of an international organization that is able to effectively suppress that. So you need a really strong organization. The UN is not strong enough. So the Catholic faith is saying you can resort to force, one country against another, if the peaceable means fail, and it sets forth the basis of just war in section 2309 of the Catechism, and you have to meet those certain categories. You also got to wage the war in a certain way, and you also have to wage the war with certain limited objectives.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah, go ahead, right ahead.
Okay, so Declaration of Independence, if I remember it right, says that they evinced a design. They saw that what Britain was doing was trying to reduce them to absolute despotism. They saw the shadow of it.
That's powerful language.
Okay, they saw the shadow. It wasn't there yet, but they were going to, as soon as they hit their Hearthstone, as soon as it bridged onto the radar screen, boom, we're acting. And they're saying, therefore, we were justified. Well, because you subjectively see a design? I mean, do you have to establish that you're about to be taken over? I mean, there's a lot of subjectivity here. Weapons of mass destruction. I mean, I feel that Iraq is threatening us here, and we have to get over there. I mean, who determines?
Well, ultimately, that's up to the leaders of the society. Under the United Nations Charter, and there's no doubt Putin leads his society.
He's got 83% before were behind him during the for several months of the war. Now he's at 77, but that's much more than what Biden has. Maybe 39% of the people support him.
Article 51 of the United Nations talks about the right of self-defense not being lost when you're attacked. Now, there's a phrase in Article 51 which is subject to a lot of scholarly debate, and what you get is nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations. And then comment until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. So what that has come to mean is something called anticipatory self-defense. Some countries have used that as the justification for their various actions.
Is that like preemptive strike?
That's the same idea, the preemptive strike. The Americans and the Israelis have used that argument repeatedly in their attacks. The invasion of Iraq was based on a number of UN Security Council resolutions, I think 1441 and 678, which dealt with the issue of weapons of mass destruction in those countries, and that was the justification of the Americans and their allies going into Iraq. The war was condemned by John Paul II. He said you did not have a moral purpose to go in there. The church has that authority to condemn wars and to condemn social structures. And I challenge everyone to read the Catechism. So those are some of the key issues, that's at the international level. In a way, what you see is today is disorder in the states within the individual countries that are leading to this. I think that disorder can be traced to the failure of these countries to accept the divine positive law and to order their societies accordingly, which is what we're all called to do. We're all called to order our societies in accordance with the divine positive law. Pope after pope has written about that. The international order is supposed to be based on the divine positive law.
Can I interrupt? You're an attorney. So what role does the law play in helping to order the society? In a sense, you could argue, well, it's all law, isn't it? No, it can't be all law. But the legal profession has to jump in and insist that it should be the divine positive law. Do they have a moral obligation to insist that it be this?
Well, we all have a moral obligation to convert and to make the society in accordance with the divine positive law. Now, some people have said we can operate with just the natural law, and I think you could argue that that is the situation in Russia now with Putin. You've got a society that is very much culturally aware as being Russians. He says that in his September 30th speech. He talks about our children, our grandchildren, great-grandchildren. You know, he talks about the culture. And, you know, the Catholic doctrine does not say that a society has got to throw away its ethnicity. No, Catholic doctrine has always said culture is important, and Christianity is always there to perfect that culture, and you have a right to defend that culture. And the natural law says, okay, that's how you're supposed to order society as a baseline. And that's what the Catholic doctrine has always said. And societies that are ordered otherwise will lead ultimately to totalitarianism, though it may be in the name of a plutocracy.
Well, I think Putin would agree with you that he would go with natural law, and he's very close to the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. But he's accusing Americans, or the West, of this Satanism, satanic, but he's also hitting on unnatural. Because of the sodomy over here, it's unnatural. It's going against natural law.
Well, his speech of September 30th is interesting. You and I talked about this before the show. It's an interesting speech. It sounds like almost a church speech in a lot of ways, right? I mean, he's talking to a lot of people with this thing. And we have to be honest with ourselves. This is also a political tool. There is a war now. It is World War V. It is between the West and this China, Russia. And we are in a state of war. I mean, it's not declared, but the rhetoric between Biden and Putin have put us there. But what Putin said, you know, in his speech was very religious, but he also targeted the elites, the Western elites. He said the Western elites have done this to their own people. Now that resonates with a lot of people. And one of these people, I think, is Michael Hudson. And Michael Hudson has said, you know, the West has gone into countries and accused the ethnic groups of racism. They did it through the CIA. And if you think back on our own country, and you look at the definition of the American people according to John Jay, who wrote in October of 1787 what constitutes the American people, which is really, in many ways, it's in accordance with the sociological definition of an ethnic group. You got to think, hey, wait a minute. Maybe that happened over here too. You have to keep an open mind, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if we are in World War V,
World War III was the Cold War, and I submit it was a war ultimately against Catholicism. World War IV was a global war of terror. Ultimately, it was a war against Islam. I believe that it was a way to interject Western values into Islamic countries, and it largely succeeded. I don't think it worked in Afghanistan, but it worked in a lot of other places. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. So that's how I count the wars. Some people say this is another Cold War. Well, it's a war by any other means because it's multiple levels, multiple tools, it's information, it's cyber, it's kinetics, it's economics, it's moral, it's all these factors in play.
But the battle is, it touches on your notion of why you're against First Amendment, but it's either, and this would happen on my case went to the Supreme Court. The morality has to be at the center. That's where the Russians are kind of coming from, and we're saying freedom. Okay, so Biden, he emphasizes you have to have freedom. He'll say it, to marry the one you love. So you have to have. If you don't have the freedom, if you're a guy and you want to marry another guy, you have to have that freedom. Americans, Ted Olson, that conservative, he argued the case to the Supreme Court for same-sex marriage. He was supposed to be a conservative. He said it was his greatest case, you know, because it really represents our values. Gettysburg Address, Declaration of Independence, all those values went into supporting same-sex marriage. Wow. I guess so. So this idea of freedom, what Wesley said, Americans want freedom from God's law. He said that right from the beginning. That's the freedom they're aiming at. And same-sex marriage is sodomy. I mean, you can't get more morally corrupt. And the Russians are going, this is, we'll die. I mean, it's a suicide to follow that path. And he's saying most of the world, I think he said 80% of the world, is against it.
Well, if you look at the sanctions, yeah, about 80% of the world's countries are not engaging in sanctions against Russia. Mexico just voted no sanctions. Saudi Arabia last week, after Putin's speech, said we're going to cut oil production 2 million barrels a day, which is 2%. Now the pundits say it's really less than that because people weren't really fully producing anyways. Today Biden says we're going to punish, you know, Saudi Arabia. I was talking with a friend of mine last night, and it's very interesting. I think his point is right. Russia has a lot of oil and natural gas, right? So if Putin falls and Russia theoretically falls, and Biden has called for the removal of Putin, he walked that back, of course, but you know, the American elites want Putin removed. So if Putin falls, Russia will probably fall under the control of the Western alliance. If that happens, with all that oil and all that gas, why do we need Saudi Arabia anymore? So I think the Saudis are starting to understand that. And so they may be seeing an alliance here with the Russians. I don't know. This is my speculation, talking to a friend who follows this like I do.
With the Saudis doing what they did, at a minimum, it's not going to cause the gas to go down. It's going to cause the gas to go up. And when people go to vote, it could be argued that that gas pump determines.
It could be. It could be. It always does. Now here's the thing. Everybody is talking about high gas prices. Michael Hudson, the economist, Paul Craig Roberts were talking about how Europe, and even Putin said, how Europe is going to lose all of its industry, okay, because of high energy costs. Well, here's the thing. There's something called the GATT, the General Agreement of Tariff and Trade. And there's an Article 16 in there that says governments can basically subsidize their industries if they need to for some emergency. So the tools are there for the EU, the European Union, and even for the US government to subsidize its own businesses so that rising energy costs don't hurt. Plus, the US government can turn on the Keystone Pipeline, and there's all sorts of oil that we can get. So the question is going to be, once again, who runs the EU? Who runs the United States? Is it the government? Or is it the powerful private interests, the elites, the plutocrats? Who is it?
Right, and who runs NATO? I mean, so NATO, the EU, and the United States. And your thesis was, when you wrote your book, you were saying the most powerful person was this certain type of businessman. And my grandfather, my dad, just admired my grandfather more than anybody else because he fit that certain type of businessman. That was where the power was.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And see, so that has been it's being maintained still.
I think that's right. Gerald Heard, a lot of people haven't heard of him, no pun intended. But Gerald Heard was like one of the most influential figures in the United States in the 20th century. Okay, he gave Ray Bradbury a start, science fiction writer. He was a huge influence in normalizing homosexuality. Okay, huge influence, very powerful, in with the Lucis. And basically, he said at Idlewild in California in 1956, the businessman knows what's morally right and wrong. He's the decider. I mean, this is the cultural guru.
Right,
so.
Right, and that's when I knew my grandfather. He died probably about 57, 58. And he was a giant. I mean, he was such a giant because I could see how people saw him.
Right. He was successful materially. And that's how you
Oh.
define value. And that's part of the capitalism that I think the church frowns upon, or church doctrine frowns upon. I mean, obviously, you know, around this Michigan, everybody wants a comfortable life. If you're successful business-wise or socially, well, you've got credibility.
But the Depression, there was a reaction to the Depression, and these guys really became more and more heroes because they kept producing. You know, they kept the money going, and that's what people wanted. They didn't want to. They didn't want to go back to that.
The entrepreneur is the arbiter of values in this society. The Elon Musks, the Michael Bloombergs, these are the guys.
Right. It's no different than the plantation owner, you know, because he's got his slaves. They got their employees. They employ people. They pay people.
They make money, billions of dollars.
Right. And the church has to get more aggressive and get the balance back and put money in where John Chrysostom says, you know, you have to preach against the love of money. You have to do it.
The church has always taught you can make a profit. There's nothing wrong with that. But the making of profit is going to be subordinated to the benefit of people.
Yep. Yep. So,
And it's going to be done by the government. Sorry.
so this is Citizens for Community Media here at Notre Dame South Bend with David Wemhoff on another World War.
Another world war.
Okay.